መልእክተ ቲዩብ የዩቲዩብ ቻናላችንን ሰብስክራይብ በማድረግ የዘወትር ተከታታዮቻችን ይሁኑ።
ጤና ይስጥልኝ ወደ መልእክተ ቲዩብ ቻናል ተከታታዮቻችን፣ ይህ የመልእክተ እንግዳ ፕሮግራማችን ነው። ዮሐንስ ተረፈ ነኝ። ዛሬ አንድ እንግዳ ይዤላችሁ ቀርቤያለሁ። ተማራ ማርያም ዳዊት ኢትዮጵያዊ ካናዳዊ ስትሆን በያዝነው ይህ እጅግ አስከፊና ከባድ በሆነው የ2020 ዓመተ ምህረት ላይ ፋይንዲንግ ሳሊ በሚል በኢትዮጵያ የፖለቲካ ታሪካችን ውስጥ ጠባሳ እንዲሁም መጥፎ አሻራ ጥሎ ያለፈውን የቀይ ሽብር ክስተት የሚመለከት ያዘጋጀችው ዶክመንተሪ ነው። ስለ ፊልሙና አንዳንድ ጉዳዮች ከሷ ጋር ቆይታ እናደርጋለን። ተማራ የእንግሊዘኛ ቋንቋ ተናጋሪ ስለሆነች ውይይቱን እናደርገው በእንግሊዘኛ ይሆናል። ለአንዳንድ ተመልካቾች ምቹ ካልሆነ አስቀድሜ ይቅርታ ጠይቃለሁ። ቀጥታ ወደሷ ወስዳችኋለሁ። ወደ እንግዳችን አብራችሁ እንድትቆዩ ጋብዛለሁ። አመሰግናለሁ። Tamara, welcome to Melikte Tube. Thank you for joining me. Could you please introduce yourself to my viewers?
Yeah, thank you so much for making time to talk to me today. As you said, my name is Tamara Mariam Dawit, and I'm a Ethiopian-Canadian filmmaker. I primarily work as a producer, but sometimes when I feel that the story really needs to be told, I'm also a director, and Finding Sally is a great example of something I felt compelled to tell through a film.
Thank you, Tamara. Before we go into Finding Sally, may I ask what is film for you?
I mean, I went to school to work in the music industry. I worked in music management. I worked in theater. I worked even for a while in the spoken word industry. So for me, film is just another extension of all those things. I just look at art, and I think, commercial art forms like film is an opportunity to tell stories and to share a window into different parts of our world and our societies. So for me, film is just a medium to share stories. And I think what I'm most interested in is really storytelling.
Let me start our conversation by quoting what you have said in the film. For many Ethiopians, it is easy to forget them than to remember. What is it you're trying to imply?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a reflection about my family and about the Red Tear and about the sort of collective trauma that I found in researching and producing this project, in that sometimes when things are difficult and painful to talk about, it's easier to push them deeper within yourself and to not deal with them. And I found that within many different examples, with my interactions with my family in Ethiopia, even the same with my interactions with my Eritrean relatives. I think it's a cultural thing that, here in Canada, I remember being taught in elementary school that, if something's bothering you, if you have some pain or sadness, you talk about it and you go to the person and you say, when you do this, this is how I feel, and you have a discussion. And that's, to me, completely the opposite culturally in Ethiopia. We don't do those things.
Yeah.
And I think in so many facets of life, it can be important to do that. And I think the Red Tear is just one big example of a huge emotional trauma that affected every family, that we've just sort of swallowed it and we have it sort of boiling inside us in our stomachs. But we're not always comfortable to deal with it. And I really wanted to make this film to try and push people to look within themselves and within their households to discuss these things.
Mm-hmm. Which is good. That's why I just want to mention it. Basically, if you look at from the cultural perspective of Ethiopian culture, there are so many things that are taboo or hidden from the family, the parents, especially. We'll go in deep about the Red Terror itself and what impact it has in society up to this generation. I've seen your short film, Grandma Knows Better, which is a fantastic short film, more or less focus on the family. You just tell your own story of the family. And What I found interesting is the kind of the cultural hybridity that you want to depict in the film, especially reuniting your grandmas in Canada is so interesting. Could you say this inspired you to make Finding Sally? Because as I find Grandma Knows Better, very family oriented film.
Well, actually, the genesis of it was I was already working on Finding Sally. And, I was trying to finance Finding Sally and realized I needed to direct a shorter piece of work, sort of as a proof of concept. And I also wanted to do something with my Ethiopian family to see how comfortable they were with being filmed. So Grandma Knows Best was a film I was able to produce in the time when I was developing Finding Sally. Really as a test case, but also because I really wanted to explore the history of my grandmothers and to do extensive interviews with my grandmothers because they're older and we don't know, how long they'll be alive and if they'll still be around by the time I finance the feature film.
Yeah, impressive. Let's talk about Finding Sally. Finding Sally, for me, I found it very moving and powerful family documentary. But this family documentary becomes universal. The family story becomes universal. In a sense, to say that, the 1970s revolution occurred in different continents, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. We can mention the Chinese Revolution. We can mention a revolution that occurred in Latin America. One good example, I would say, is the Argentinian Revolution, where the Dirty War occurred, which is resembled with the Red Terror of Ethiopia. And thousands and thousands of youth people were killed because of their idols. And filmmakers, Octavio Giattino and Fernando Solanos have been directed a powerful movie, which is called The Hour of Furnaces. It shows the real story of struggle, poverty, and revolution. And The Hour of Furnaces was become more or less a bridge to bring the community or the nation together to kind of build or rebuild the nation, as it teaches what has happened with the brutality of the repressive government of Argentina by preserving the history and make it in a film to educate the audience in terms of building one nation, which has been failed by a system. And I found Finding Sally in that level, which goes deep down to bring back the old wound that society had. And what was your preparation like prior to making Finding Sally? Even though it's a family story, mostly you rely on family things. How did you do your research in terms of Red Terror? What is your knowledge about Red Terror prior to making it? Plus, have you seen any films which was made by Ethiopian filmmakers? And if so, which ones?
መልእክተ Tube.
I've always been interested in the Red Terror and wanting to do something about it. So it was interesting that I didn't know how my own family was affected because they weren't talking about it, which is what led to this film. But really the first thing that I did was sort of twofold. One, in keeping in mind, it took me 10 years to make Finding Sally. So I had a lot of time to spend on research and investigation of the Red Terror, of the student movement, which included reading all the books that had been published on it. For the books that were written in Amharic, having someone else read them for me and give me notes on them or translate certain texts. Certainly watching all of the movies, and that included actually watching a lot of the government sort of historical / propaganda documentaries on the period that are in the archive in ETV and the international and Ethiopian films on that period. And then a big portion of it was actually talking to people. So talking to people in the neighborhood where my family lived about the impact of the Red Terror in their community, talking to people who were with Sally and her husband in the EPRP, people who worked with her when she worked at Nefas Silk, tracking down her high school boyfriends in Canada, her other classmates, like the sort of the full circle of doing as much research as I possibly could into the historical period and also into Sally and her personality, because I didn't want to be relying only on the memory of my aunts.
Just to add more to that, there is a film called Morning Dew, directed by the renowned Ethiopian filmmaker, Garima, released in 2008. And also a documentary, Dilej, Yewanz Ma'abel Amharic, directed by Salem Makra in 1997, who resides in America. Both depicting the Red Terror and the repression of the then government. What I found interesting in your film is the way it pieces the chain of events is so astonishing. And for one to watch it from one scene to another, immersed. We'll talk differences that I chose that we can discuss, which I found the core elements of the film, starting with the opening scene. The opening scene will bring a flashback to a lot of people in that era, especially those people involved in the PPRLP and the Ethiopian nationals, because the way you portrayed the opening scene is different from other movies that you see. Why did you choose that scene, the opening scene, which we call it establishing shot? Plus, you introduce with your narration that the door is open for you, which has been closed for a long time. And now here we go. You just give the audience that the door is open for you to tell the story of your aunt, the disappeared aunt that you don't know. And why did you choose the mothers, the two mothers, to begin with your story?
That's something that wasn't in the initial plan of things to shoot. But when, as a process of the research, I realized that those two women, my grandmother and Sally's mother-in-law, hadn't seen each other in something like 30 years. And they live in the same city. They don't live that far apart. And I thought that's kind of strange. And I think as a part of my research, I want to put them back together. And I want to interrogate, like, why have they not kept in touch, and what were the dynamics of their relationship? And I thought, well, we're going to film that, obviously, because we're making a film. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't something until we started editing and that we realized that that was one of the really, I think, sweet and tender emotional touch points of the film that really helped open it up and show you that this is a personal story. And they sort of set up, I think, very clearly that there's a huge trauma and there's a huge pain, and that this film is going to unpack that. And I think, the idea of using that as the opening scene was very much something that came from the editor. And to your earlier point about, this is a story of the Red Terror, but there have been so many Red Terrors in other countries around the world. The editor of the film is Iranian, and she lived through the revolution in Iran. And part of the reason why she cut this film with me was because she gets it. She understands all of the things, all of the emotional touch points, and the trauma of going through this type of thing as a person and as a nation. And it was really her eye that said, what, this works well in the opening. And then we really fought with the rest of the team to keep that there. And I think it was a really wise decision.
It brings back the past memory, especially to victims and the victims' family. It was a daily, a normal event to unfold every day, to see dumped body in the street. And that little village tells a lot. And it's a very powerful scene for me. As you know, telling a family story is not easy, because you're not telling somebody else's story. As you are part of it, in a way, sometimes telling it can be emotional, or your story can be directed through that. But what I found impressive is the way you introduce us of the family member. By coincidence, most of them are women, elegant women, I would say. You just tell us with the character and enough information about their background. I like it, It's, in a way, it looks like we're watching a feature film rather than documentary, the way you piece it together. And also what I want to touch here is the use of gender. Most of them are women. Probably that's a coincidence. Or is it to show the role of women in men-dominated society? Or you just want to raise the gender issue. Is that what it is you're targeting, or it's just subconsciously just use it?
The focus on women was something that happened by accident. And then when I realized it was happening and thought about it more, it became completely intentional. Because of course, I mean, my family is all women primarily. So when I looked at, the subjects who can speak about Sally from the family's perspective, they're only women. And then when I started to look at, the wider literature and films about the Red Tear, they're mostly told from the perspective of men.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when we talk about history, women will tell things with a different sensitivity, a different level of emotion, and a different sort of community memory, whereas men sometimes project their memories in a much more internal, personalized way. But it was really the decision in terms of also deciding who will I put in the film that can talk about Sally as her friend, as one of her comrades, because there were certainly a lot of men that I've met, that I did pre-interviews with, that added a lot of help and support to my research. But I really thought, this is a film that I want to only talk about the revolution from the perspective and the memories of women, and to do it in that way, to make it a little bit different.
You executed well and shows the role of women, including, even though Sally, the one who disappeared, there are so many women disappeared the same way as Sally herself. And this Sally story represents most of the women in Ethiopia. And it hasn't been, shown enough that the role women have in our society. Women has been contributed a lot in Ethiopian society. Name it from health, sport, literature, and so many various things that the women role hasn't been touched or, told enough. So I found it very imperative for society to know. Let's look back to a scene where Kubra visiting the place where she was incarcerated. You take her back to the old memory, the past memory, to the past wound, I would say, which is amnesia to it. And the way you use the camera, the tracking, the music, is so moving, so touching. It looks like, as if it happens now. And we see the fear of her, the emotion from the facial expression that you've used. I found this so interesting and very impressive. The lighting, we could say much of it in terms of cinematography, which we can cover just a little at the end. Tell me the emotion once again, and then the feeling of creating or revisiting a scene that a woman who has been carried for a long time. It's almost 3 or 4 decades. And as soon as she reached, after the camera tracking in and out, we see her even in a moment of stumbling. It gives a symbolic code with the person's psychological state of the person. And you beautifully executed it. And if you tell me the emotion of Kubra and yourself, one time even you went to Haga, and she don't know how to put it. As soon as she see the flashback came, that immersed audience, regardless whether you know the history of Red Terror. You don't have to know the history of Red Terror, basically. And that makes the audience finding ourselves with the subject, in this case, Kubra. Tell me how challenging or how is it emotionally for you?
I think there's always the challenges and the risks of making an observational documentary, or in this case, the observational portions of the film. Because, I knew that that's actually the Pankhurst family house in Old Airport.
Richard Pankhurst.
Okay. Which is interesting because, the Pankhurst family and my grandparents know each other. They actually live quite close together, but no one had really put it together fully that was the house where Kibra was kept.
Okay.
She had never been back there inside, although she'd been many times, in that neighborhood. So that's an example of a scene that we thought it could be interesting to take her back there. We, asked her about it. Would she be willing to do that? Because we knew it would be traumatic potentially. But she was willing to. And I mean, there's other places that we took Kibra to that relate to the Red Tear that aren't in the film because they weren't that interesting, in fact, or we couldn't get, as good access. So it's part of the roll of the dice in making this type of film, that you do set up these scenes as a filmmaker and sort of wait to see what happens and if it works. And I think very much so with this film in particular, we spent a lot of time on the care and the management of the characters to make sure that they were comfortable talking about this, they were comfortable going to these places, and that they had the necessary sort of family and or social psychological support around them after they were being interviewed. So especially for my grandmother, for Abaret, there's footage in the longer film where we actually take Abaret and follow her for a day, which I don't think much of that is in the Al Jazeera version. And there's extended footage on the Finding Sally website with Abaret in her household and talking more, personally about what happened to her when she was incarcerated during the Red Tear. So I think all of those moments are important, but it's, you sort of have a duty of care to the subjects when you're doing them.
Interesting. I mean, I was going to ask you because when you make a movie in a country like Ethiopia, you don't think about having the psychological impact of once, when someone is talking about the psychological trauma that they've been through. And done an interesting thing because, as I said, the amnesia and the trauma that the Kubrat has went through, it clearly reflected in the film. And once again, I found it very interesting scene, which says much of the documentary itself. Take it to the final or the closure scene of your documentary. We see the family getting together, they're all in one car, heading to Asimba to expect unexpected. They don't know what to find when they go there. As soon as we arrive, we see the camera showing us the cinematography was brilliant. We see a good landscape of the countryside, especially Asimba, the mountainous place, where it is popular by, or it is a base of the EPRP or IHAPA. And in one scene, we see the landlady, Baruva, was telling the story of Sally, the last moment of Sally. And as she's saying, she had poison on her leg, and she died, unfortunately. In one shot, exterior shot, we see the whole family sitting together in sadness, taking them back to the old wound, the old memory. And we see you in the shot as well, as the documentary itself is a quest, I would say. Finding Sally is itself a documentary which opened the wound and the collective silence of the family, clearly depicted in the scene where we see for the first time that male subject or a male character appearing in the documentary, unveiling the monument which was made for Sally and Salota, her husband, buried together. What is the emotion like? I mean, after this long time, we spend some time, to make the documentary basically, and you take all the family, convincing them to be part of the documentary itself. And how was it? What was the end? What was the quest like? How did you feel when you see that the closure of Sally come to an end?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's another example of a sequence that's observational. So we really didn't know what would happen. How would my aunts react to the things I've set up for them there in terms of the memorial? But I mean, going to Asimba and Alatena in that area was a huge part of the research of the film because we took multiple trips there to do pre-interviews, to scout, to look at the locations, to do work with the church. I mean, a lot of that access was actually really made possible through working through the Catholic Church, both in Addis and in Adigrat. Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of footage in the film that we filmed in Mekelle and Adigrat, and recreations that we did sort of around between Adigrat and Alatena and around Wukro. We worked with the theater department from the University of Adigrat. So it was really something where we were trying to involve the community and work with the community. And for me, it was shocking for me to find out that so many people in that village remembered Sally specifically. And, she didn't even live there for that long, a little bit under a year. But she stood out, and people, not just Brew, were coming up to us and telling us their memories, and people were coming up to me and telling me that I looked like her. So for me, that was probably the most emotionally heavy part of the production, to be in that space. And to see, where Sally was living and the bed she was on when she passed away. I think it was emotional for the whole family. But I think hopefully that for my aunts, it's given them some closure, because some of them have been up there already before, but this trip really enabled us to pull all the pieces together. And I think it's, like you've said, there's so many different political aspects to how did Sally die? How did her husband die? And I really didn't feel that was necessary to explore in the film. The film is much more about how do we deal with these things when they happen, and how can we learn from them and move forward, not so much of an unpacking of who did what when.
መልእክተ Tube.
Cinema is a tool that we use to educate and entertain our viewers, basically, whether it is past or the future, And do you think you played the role that you wanted to play, especially achieving the goal, that finding Sally and discovering it, and put the family at peace, basically? There are a lot of families in this position who don't want to say much of their feeling. Do you think that you achieved in the film what you want to achieve?
I don't know that my goal was to put my family at peace. That maybe became the goal partway through the process, to try and do that. But really, my goal from the beginning was when I found out that Sally existed. It was when I actually saw this photo that's behind me, a copy of that my grandmother had up. And in talking to my grandmother was horrified that I didn't know about Sally. And she said, this is not correct. This is dangerous. If you don't know about her, what about younger people in our family that don't know what she fought for and what the other young people were standing up for and why they lost their lives? And this story has to be documented. So it was sort of my grandmother giving me the push that this must be done so that change can happen today by reflecting on the past. And then also going and talking to Salota's mother, because even though he's not in the film as much, it's also about him. And I wanted to have that permission and encouragement from both aspects and from both of the sort of elders of the story to say that, this should be done, and that they wanted this to happen. So that was really what drove me.
So this is more or less, as you indicate, your grandma was surprised that you don't know much about Sally. Yeah, this is what we call, collective silence, that you don't hear it from any of the aunties. Do you think it is to do with the aspect of the Ethiopian culture? It would be different with the Western culture.
I don't know that it's so much, it's a mixture of a lot of things, because as much as my aunts are Ethiopian, for the most part, they're also very Western or North American, because they spent a good portion of their lives abroad. So they're like me, we're sort of a mix of all these things. But I think it's something that's traumatic. It's painful. It's also, for the members of the family who were living in Ethiopia during the Derg, you weren't allowed to talk about this stuff. It wasn't safe. You couldn't have, the family couldn't have a funeral for Sally or any sort of memoriam in Addis. That's why, people knew. Some of my cousins knew that she had passed away, but couldn't tell anyone. And that's why it took them 7 years to find out, because, they had to wait until my grandparents were both in the US and both managed to get a visa to leave Ethiopia, because before that, they weren't being allowed out on the same trip. One would go and the other one would be held back. So it was the waiting for that to happen for people to be able to tell them, which I think is, also just tied into this secrecy and this internalization of not being able to talk about this, which I totally don't think was intentional. I just think it's part of the snowballing of what happened. When you get used to not talking about something, it becomes sort of second nature to not do it.
Let's talk about the aesthetic of the film, the content and the form, the way you narrate, the way you put a chain of events, piece them together. You give us a story of Emperor Haile Selassie, the youth movement, the Derg, then you go to the Red Terror and the impact of it. These all things, well worked for the documentary, I would say. The use of sound, the music in general. The cinematography is brilliant. You try to show the Ethiopian culture, the religion. I mean, he raised different issues from religion, culture, revolution, days, love. He said much about music itself. He touched a lot of things. And the use of sound in the film is very powerful. Let me take you back to to the climax, the closure scene. And we hear a kind of echoed music that you used at the end. What is it you want to imply? Is it sort of disappearance or loneliness?
Music for me was one of the most important parts, and perhaps it's because I come from working in the music industry, and I spent a lot of time and energy with the musicians on the score, and the score was completely a collaboration between Zaki Ibrahim, who's a South African Canadian musician, and Zaki made the score, but also appears in the film sort of as the voice or the ghostly voice of Sally. So all of the vocals that you hear throughout the film is Zaki doing that. And then Zaki collaborated with Abagaz Shiota in Ethiopia on the score, and a number of other Ethiopian musicians and vocalists in terms of session playing. So we were really trying to use voice as an instrument in doing the score to give the human emotion and to try and add in Sally's voice, because of course we have no recordings of her, whether audio or video. And then we also really tried to find important songs from that era, including sort of the EPRP anthem, which is used at the end of the film, sung by Sally, because so many of the comrades who were there would tell me they would sing that song. So we tracked down a version of the song and used that in the film. And we also used, in two instances, a Derg sort of propaganda song, which is a war cry that they had adapted to play on the radio whenever they were going to announce the anarchists that they had killed. And a lot of people that I interviewed, including Abaret, would talk about that song and about hearing that song and that knowing like they were going to get bad information when they heard it. So we wanted to use that song, but also reimagine it. So we've taken the lyrics of that song into also the music at the end of the film.
How long did it take you to direct the film, from pre-production up to the screening period? And also in terms of budget, did you get any sponsors, or where did you get the budget from?
It took me 10 years to make the film. And a long part of that was, of course, I wanted time to do the research, but what was probably the longest process was raising money, because the film is financed in Canada. And, I'm lucky as a Canadian to be able to access government and provincial state financing for film production. But on the other hand, it's also very, very difficult to finance a Black film, to finance an African story. Finding Sally was difficult to finance because of that, but because of the family having lived in Canada, because I'm in the film and I'm a Canadian, there was some ability to maneuver in that regard. But I mean, there were also challenges to that. We had to use in many aspects Canadian crew, because when you're taking money from a certain country, you need to make expenditures in that country.
Yes, of course.
And the Canadian crew were wonderful, but I also was really adamant in also having Ethiopian crew and finding ways to include them. Okay. And finding also, learning opportunities for them. So if you look at some of the film that we shot during development, which includes the opening scene with the two older women meeting. That was shot by the Ethiopian DOP.
Okay.
And to me, that's the most important part of the film.
Yeah.
So I think as much as it is a Canadian production, where it was possible, it's fully a collaboration.
It's good for the Ethiopian film industry as well, for the Ethiopian filmmakers, which I will be discussing a little about the Ethiopian film on my further question. How was the reception like upon release, both in Canada, especially with the Ethiopian community? I know you got the upper hand of using the English language basically to make it universal, and running after to use a subtitle like put Amharic or something. But what is your plan, to distribute it or screen it for various groups, especially, I don't know if you had done it, the screening in Ethiopia, but it has to be Amharic dubbed, or do you have any plan to do that?
I mean, a lot of the distribution of the film is disrupted or pivoted because of COVID. So, the film has been in festivals since last January. Other than the very first festival screening in Sweden, they have all been online. So it's a really different experience in terms of connecting with audiences. But we have been getting a lot of feedback, especially from the Ethiopian diaspora through social media, through people emailing us. And I think it's really, for me, it's just reinforcing that the film is starting intergenerational conversations within households, that young people are tweeting and saying, oh, I've asked my grandmother and there's something similar in my family. Or people are saying, I've decided I'm going to tell my niece or my children about what happened to me in the 1970s. So that's a wonderful output. But for me, I mean, the most important part of this is the release in Ethiopia. And waiting until there's a time when we can do that properly in person to have conversations, when it's safe for people to gather in cinemas. I know that cinemas are starting to open up right now, but I'm not convinced that it's yet safe and appropriate to be doing that. And I want to bring together, especially elders in the community, to watch the film. And I don't want to be doing anything that's risky in that regard. And then to your other question, in terms of the language of the film, I mean, all the characters in the film spoke in the language that they were most comfortable speaking in. Of course, the fact that most of them speak in English is of great benefit for making the film more digestible internationally, which is why, the film aired on television in Canada. It will air again in Canada. It's been sold to a broadcaster in the US. The English language short version, was workable with Al Jazeera, also because of the language. It just makes it more accessible in that regard. But it's very important for me to also have the film available in other languages in Ethiopia. So the film is just in the final stages of being dubbed right now into Amharic, so that it can be aired on television in Ethiopia in the coming months. And then afterwards, I want to also have the film dubbed into other local languages so that the distribution can be increased, and so that the film can be used by schools and other institutions to have conversations. But I think, the other thing I'm most interested in doing is going back to Asimba with the film and showing the film to the community and the characters there who supported us and took part in the process.
Yeah, that's interesting. But as you know, there are a lot of Ethiopian diaspora in Canada and America, especially those who passed through the Red Terror. And there is even an online group on Facebook, Red Terror victims, families, who always wanted justice, especially some do think that, we have one of the main man of the mastermind of Red Terror, Mengistu Haile Mariam, who reside basically in Zimbabwe. He celebrated his 80th birthday few months back, and but the people, the youngsters, I think as young as 12 or 13-year-old, has been murdered or killed by Red Terror. They didn't even have a chance to celebrate their 18th birthday. And there is this remorse in society. I mean, even to bring reconciliation is very difficult. But films like this, do you think could have an impact in healing the past wounds that society have? And what could people in this sort of position learn from this kind of film?
I mean, there's a lot of question and conversation around justice and what does justice mean for different people. And it's not, my position through the film to make a huge, I guess, comment about that. But I do know that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch both published op-eds which ran in the Addis Standard back when Finding Sally first premiered in festivals, and it was very much inspired by the film and something that we did in collaboration with them to look at, what is the role and the space for transitional justice in Ethiopia, and how well has it worked versus how well has it not worked, and how does that help us with going forward in the future. And I mean, I asked both my grandmother and Abaret when I was filming with them about how do they feel about, whether people have been punished properly or not for the ills that they did during this period. And both of them, sort of said, it's not for us to decide what should happen to those people. God will judge them. That's because they're very, religious women. I'm not a religious person, but it was very interesting. And, I think Abaret was even called to testify in some of the court cases, and eventually just said this, for her, didn't have a purpose. She felt that, karma, I guess, would take a different form. But I know that there's certainly people who do believe in the judicial process and think that that's important. And I think that those dialogues and discussions should be had because, we're facing very similar crimes and issues today in Ethiopia. And how are we going to deal with the perpetrators of those if we haven't perhaps properly dealt with the perpetrators of past crimes? And I think that, for me, is a big thing that the film can help us think about. What have we learned since the Red Terror? And, how are we repeating these things again today? And why are we not learning from our past? And that should really be, for me, the main focus.
As you know, the purpose of Red Terror, making the movie, teaching, whether you make it in film or writing, you teach the audience or readers. Basically, the Red Terror, the government should learn the mistake that has been done from terror. But at the moment, I mean, as you know, the history of Ethiopia that hasn't been colonized by any Western power, the past 27 years, we had this ethnic federalism or ethnocentric government, which has been divided, people fighting by different ethnicity. And recently, if you followed the politics of Ethiopia, there was a massacre that happened in Maikadra, the last 27 years of the brutal TPLF regime, which has been leading the power for almost 3 decades. There is a saying, history repeats itself. That's what I would say. Even though if it's not in the state of Red Terror, there is a lot of killings. There is a lot of disappearance that occurred in the last 27 years. Are we as a society will be passed or will be excused or will be pardoned by just making a memorial like the Red Terror Memorial? So you just visit that memorial and take a glimpse of your family and live in sorrow, live in silence. So if we don't learn from it, we got to repeat it and again. We can't see clearly from the situation. As with me and you speak today, the current situation in Ethiopia is very, very difficult, the things. And I mean, we haven't learned that much. What do you say to that? And what is your vision about Ethiopia?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to think about who is learning. Because, the Red Terror Memorial Museum was a partner of mine in Addis in researching. We shot in their location multiple times. But if you talk to them and the guides and the managers of the museums about who goes in there, it's primarily tourists and people who have some connection to that period. But the other people who should be going in there is young people. If you look at something like the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you see school groups who go there to learn about that period and understand it. You don't see that same reflection in the curriculum in Ethiopia. When I think, I went to the Addis Ababa University to try and find like a PhD student studying the Red Terror who could work with me and assist with research. And the dean told me, well, we don't study that period. That's not history. We study, Lalibela and the Aksumite Empire. We study ancient history. We don't study current history. And I think those are huge oversights, because that means that the people who are remembering and learning from the past are the people who are, the older generation, and we need to focus more on the younger generation.
Yeah, we need more an institution that teaches and educate the right narrative. I mean, the main problem that we have currently is the false narrative been spreading, especially the social media on Facebook and different social media groups. Let me come up to, now you're working in Ethiopia as well. They have a production, Gobas, you name it, Gobas, which is your Gobas in making this film as well. Tell me, I mean, the sort of programs that you set up to do in Ethiopia, and what advice you give to aspiring young filmmakers?
መልእክተ Tube.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a production company in Ethiopia for over a decade, one to do a lot of my own films through, but also in the last 5 years of living in Addis and making Finding Sally, I really felt it was important to not only be there to make my own films, but to also start to produce for other Ethiopian filmmakers and help them get access to get out of the country with their content. So there's a number of Ethiopian directors, writer-directors that I'm working with as a producer. And then on the other hand, because, it's not possible for me to produce everyone's film, we need more producers in the country. We need more people who understand the business of making art and making film. So I've been really focused on pushing the government, when possible, on policy reforms that will help the industry, and also training and capacity building for filmmakers. So running a number of labs and export missions to really help creators start to understand the global film industry and the business of making a film.
What do you think of Ethiopian cinema? Have you seen a lot of Ethiopian films made?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of Ethiopian films. I've done a few research projects into the film industry for different European funders and institutions. So I feel like I try and keep a very close finger on the pulse of what's happening with the film industry. I think we make a lot of really good films. We have a lot of really good creatives, but often where we lack is the business side and the ability to produce a film that can be exported. And often it comes down to the technical capacity of not having access to equipment, which comes back to the issues of the government, that as long as film equipment is deemed as luxury goods and taxed so high, it's difficult for filmmakers to access all of the tools and equipment that they need to produce something at a quality that it can be exported, that it can be sold to Al Jazeera or the BBC or other channels. And I can say that I know that these channels are really interested in content about Ethiopia told by Ethiopians. They're just not getting enough content produced at the production format that they require to broadcast it. So I think there's a need for interventions at a number of areas, so that I'm not one of the few filmmakers on the international circuit. There should be more of us. And especially in documentary, I really want to encourage more people to make documentaries and to think of documentaries as similar or equivalent to feature films, and not just talking head propaganda projects.
I think that's the problem we have. Do you think there is an Ethiopian film industry?
There's a film industry. I mean, we produce a lot of films per year. But I think, we're very similar to a country like Nigeria, where we're producing a lot of films for the domestic industry. The question is, how many of those filmmakers want to produce films that go out of Ethiopia? And it's fine if you want to make a film that's simply for television and cinema in Ethiopia. My interest is in working with the filmmakers who want to be exported.
My opinion is that the film industry is more or less controlled by few individuals from the time that I spent in Ethiopia. And technically speaking, especially when you take your knowledge from abroad, there is a lot of challenge that we face basically. And as a Gobas Media, I hope you produce more films soon. And what is the next plan for Tamara 2021? What should we expect from you?
I mean, I'm producing other projects. One of them is shooting right now in Ethiopia, but I think, the most important thing for me will be doing the in-person screenings with Finding Sally. And I also want to use those screenings as an opportunity to record video testimonies with other survivors and witnesses to the Red Terror, because I want to collect a larger archive of these memories, because it's important to have that for us as a nation.
Great. I agree with that. We need it. We need more people to be involved. But in this, I would suggest, as documentary filmmakers, as filmmakers in general, to make it balanced. If we have the other groups, those involved, I mean, as you know, in Canada and America, those perpetrators have been caught. We can mention Kalbesa Nago, who was being caught in America by a Canadian woman, I think Harbaba, probably you might come across to her.
Mm-hmm.
She spotted him at the workplace. I mean, this kind of things bring relief, even though, you don't bring the past, at least some others can learn from it. Like you said, we need proper institutional education. So where can our viewers watch your film? And if they want to reach you, if you give your contact?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best place to find out information on screenings is the website, which is findingsally.com, or the Finding Sally doc Facebook page, which actually publishes frequently both in English and in Amharic. And that's where we're posting updates on screenings, but there should be a broadcast in Ethiopia, I would say in the next 2 months, of the Amharic version. And otherwise, the short version is still on the Al Jazeera website until around December the 11th.
Interesting. Anything else that you want to say to our viewers or to those at home? I'll give you the opportunity and we end our conversation there.
No, I'm just happy to have had this conversation. And, if people have other questions or comments, they can certainly reach out to us through the social media channels for the film.
I wish you good luck in your future works, and I praise you for bringing this powerful self or family-based story, which I see it as a global story of a terror that affected so many all over the world, in particular Ethiopia. And I admire that you combined or embodied both cultures of the Ethiopianness and the Canadianness, in particular your interest, your passion about Ethiopia that deeply reflects in your movies. And I wish you all the success. Thank you for being as a guest in Melikte Tube. Melikte Tube is a YouTube channel, as I said, an entertainment channel, which do filming as well. I wish you good luck and thank you so much. Amarኛ ከቻልሽ ጤና ይስጥልኝ።
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara.
መልእክተ ቲዩብ።
እሺ እንግዲህ ወደ መልእክተ ቲዩብ ቻናል ተከታታዮቻችን እስካሁን ስትከታተሉት የነበረው የመልእክተ እንግዳ ፕሮግራማችን ነው። የዛሬ እንግዳችን ታመራ ዳዊት በፋይንዲንግ ሳሊ በሚል በቀይ ሽብር ወቅት የጠፋችውን የአክስቷን ታሪክ በጥሩ ሁኔታ በዶክመንተሪ መልክ አቅርባለን። እሱ ላይ ነበር ውይይት እናደርግ የነበረው። ከዚህ ውይይት ከዶክመንተሪው ብዙ ቁም ነገር እንደምታገኙበት፣ በተለይም በዚህ ባስከፊው በኢትዮጵያ ታሪክ ጠባሳና ለአመታት ሲነገርለት በኖረው የቀይ ሽብር ሰማዕታቶች በቀይ ሽብር ብዙ እንግልት እስከ ሞት ድረስ የደረሰባቸው ብዙ ወገኖቻችን ናቸው። እንግዲህ እንዲህ አይነት ነገሮች አምኔዥያ ወይንም ትሮማዎች በውስጣችን ስለሚቆዩ ሂሊንግ ፕሮሰሱ ብዙ ጊዜ ይፈጃል። የዚህ ዶክመንተሪ ትልቁ ኢምፓክት ሳይኮሎጂካሊ የተሰራበት ነው። ይህም ሰዎች ያመቁትን ፊሊንግ በማውጣት መልኩ ከሳይንሳዊ አኳያ ሲኒማ ራሱ ሳይንስ ግንኙነት አለው። ሳይኮሎጂካል አፕሮቾች በነዛ መልኩ ምን ያህል ሰዎችን ካለባቸው ቁስል ለማከም እንደሚችል የሚያሳይ ጥሩ ዶክመንተሪ ነው። ሞር እንደዛ አይነት ስራዎች ደግሞ መሰራት አለባቸው ብዬ እላለሁ። ውስጥ ያለንን ታሪኮች ያወጣን ዳግም ስህተቶች ተፈጠሙ አሉ። በቅርብ ድረስ እንግዲህ ማይካድራውን መውሰድ እንችላለን የማይካድራ አንድ ብሔር ላይ ያነጣጠረ ዘር ፍጅት የዘር ማጥፋት ከሬድ ቴረር ጄኖሳይድ ደርሷል ማለት ነው እንግዲህ ታሪካችን ይህ ስህተት ዳግም ደግሞ አሁን ባለነው ወቅት ተደጋግሞ እንዳይመጣ ትምህርት መሰጠት አለበት ከሽብር ራሱ በትምህርት ደረጃ ሊሰጥ የሚችል አንድ ራሱን የቻለ ታሪክ ክስተት ነው ምክንያቱም በየትምህርት ቤቱ እንደምታውቁት ነው ሂትለር በሰራው ዘር ማጥፋት በጁሾች ላይ በትልቅ ትምህርት ነው የሚሰጠው እንግዲህ ትምህርት ቤት ሄደን ካየን በእንግሊዝ ሀገር ከልከመንም ፕሮባብሊ አሜሪካ ውስጥ ይሆናል እንጂ ብላክ ሂስትሪ ብዙ ደንታምላቸውም ለማስተማር ምክንያቱም የብላክ ላይፍ ማተርስ እንቅስቃሴ ሲመጣ ነው ሪሰንትሊ እንግሊዝ ውስጥ አታችሁ ከሆነ ኦክቶበር ብላክ ሂስትሪ መንስ ሲከበርም አንዳንድ ነገሮች ትንሽ በመሻል ደረጃ ፕሮግራሞች ሲሰሩ የታየውና እንቅስቃሴ ስለሚፈልግ እንደ አይነቱን ነገሮች ማከም የምንችለው ፊልምም እንደ አንድ ጥበብ የራሱ ሚና ስላለው ያን ሚና መጫወት ስለሚችል በዚህ ነገር ውስጥ ያለፉ ሰዎችን በእንግድነት እየጋበዝንም በማቅረብም ታሪካቸውን እንዲናገሩ መድረኩን ከፍተናል ማንኛውም በዚህ ጉዳይ ላይ ለመወያየት የሚፈልግ መልእክተ ቲዩብ መድረኩ ክፍት ነው በፕሮግራሙ ጥሩ ትምህርትና ተመክሮ እንዳገኛችሁበት በመተማመን ፊልሙን እንድታዩት እንዲሁም ከታች ሌሎች ፊልሞችም ሊንክ አስቀምጠንላችኋል እሱን ይሁት ከዚህ በተረፈ እንግዲህ ፕሮግራማችንን ለመከታተል ቋሚ ደንበኛ ለመሆን የመልእክተ ቲዩብ ሰብስክራይብ ምትለዋን በተን ይጫኑና ደውሏን በመንካት ፕሮግራማችን ሳያመልጦ በተከታታይ የሚመጡትን ፕሮግራሞች ማየት ይችላሉ እንግዲህ ፕሮግራማችን ይሄን ይመስል ነበር ዘና እንዳላችሁበት ትምህርትና ቁም ነገር እንዳገኛችሁበት ባለሙሉ ተስፋ ነኝ ፕሮግራሙን ስመራው የቆየሁት ዮሐንስ ተረፈ ነኝ ቸርን ሰንብት አመሰግናለሁ